Introduction: The work dogma. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. When you come out, it will be dark. The sun will not shine for you today. The above quotation is taken from Elio Petri's 1971 film La classe operaia va in paradiso. The film gives a fictionalized account of the struggles of the Italian autonomist movement, a loose coalition of students, workers, feminists, and unemployed people who protested in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s. The quote is a slogan, shouted through a megaphone at 8 o'clock in the morning and intended for the ears of the hundreds of workers who at that time were filing through the factory gates for another day of repetitive and hazardous labor. I quote it here as a perfect illustration of what the autonomists were fighting for. Their cause went beyond the traditional union demands for fairer pay and better working conditions. They acknowledged the need for greater freedom and equality within work, but also fought for the right of workers to lead richer lives outside of work. The autonomists protested at the wasted time, lack of variety, and excessive administration of life in capitalist society. They fought for the right of workers to feel the sun on their skin, to play with their children, to develop interests and skills outside the factory, and to rest peacefully at night. We might say that the appeal of the autonomists was not just to the injustices of exploitation, but also to the workers' diminished sensory experience of the world. Nearing these concerns, a range of social critics have set out to question work from an emancipatory standpoint, supporting a vision of social progress based on a reduction of work and an expansion of free time. These critics did not deny the importance of work, nor did they dismiss the many pleasures to be found in productive activity. But they did propose that a reduction of work might leave people with more time and energy for their own self-development. These critiques of work have provoked their readers by highlighting the casualties of a work-centered society: the time for politics, contemplation, conviviality, and spontaneous enjoyment, which have been displaced by capitalism's narrow focus on commercial production and consumption. For today's students, who find themselves pushed through an education system focused largely on socializing the young for a future job role, to read these critiques is to receive an education in desire, and a reminder that time could be spent differently. The radical nature of these theories, however, has earned them a marginal position in academic and public debates. Whilst important issues like pay inequalities and poor working conditions are still discussed, it is rarer for social commentators to question the ethical status of work itself. Whilst this is certainly true, the alternative vision of social development implied in calls for a less work-centered future has seen a modest resurgence in recent times. Go to any high street bookshop and alongside those books promising to instruct readers on how to influence others, accumulate fortunes, and achieve career success, one can also find a shelf of books telling readers to slow down, find a better work-life balance, and seek happiness by consuming less. In the context of contemporary capitalist societies, narrowly fixated as they are on the activities of working and spending, the ultimate message of these books is a valuable one, tapping into a rippling disquiet about the ways in which work has crept into and colonized our lives. If these popular critiques have ultimately had a limited influence on society's priorities, however, it is perhaps because they have tended to stray too far into the genre of self-help. Their mistake has been to approach the domination of work as primarily a problem of individual habits, and it is fair to say that these books have been rather more conservative when it comes to discussing those systemic economic and political changes which might offer people a more genuine range of lifestyle choices. More promising than the stagnant discussion of work-life balance is the emergence of a braver critique of the paradigm of economic growth. Conventionally, governments have treated economic growth and life satisfaction as one and the same thing, measuring both of these via the metric of gross domestic product per capita. GDP is an indicator which quantifies a country's overall economic activity. It accounts for the total amount of earning and spending that took place in a given year, and it is tacitly accepted that a rising level of GDP indicates an overall improvement in national prosperity. Whilst economic growth is undoubtedly crucial for less developed countries, in which subsistence needs remain unmet, a range of commentators in more affluent societies have questioned the value of GDP growth as a social goal and an index of progress. A report commissioned in 2008 by the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy argues that the time is ripe for our measurement system to shift emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. The report stresses, among other things, the important role for human flourishing of health, education, relationships, and the environment, and represents just one entry in a growing base of evidence to suggest that happiness, security, and human progress will no longer flow in an unproblematic fashion from a growth in GDP. This developing uneasiness about the equation of economic growth with life satisfaction has seen sociologists, and even some economists, returning to the fundamental philosophical question of what it means to live a good life. Critical commentators and the new sociologists of happiness are once again talking about the ars vitae, or art of living. and this has inevitably led them to question whether our well-being is best served by capitalism's single-minded commitment to economic growth. Some have relied on statistical measures of people's subjective well-being, whereas others have drawn inspiration from more philosophical sources. Aristotle's vision of the good life is a common reference point. Aristotle suggested that humans flourish when they live wisely, justly, and in harmony with the world. According to his notion of eudaimonia, a sense of well-being is achieved not simply through sensory pleasure, but also through things like good health, security, companionship, autonomy, a sense of being respected and socially recognized, and a feeling of connection with the community and environment. All these things are important because humans are ethical, social and creative beings, as well as sensing bodies. If the ongoing drive to boost economic growth has become troubling for many, this is partly because of its decidedly anti-Aristotelian fixation on material gain as the route to prosperity. In an age of material abundance, it seems that there is a troubling disparity between our desire for the good life and capitalism's narrower focus on the constant expansion of production and consumption. What most people crave is more free time and a greater investment in the social aspects of life. But a growing awareness of this fact has done very little to upset the mainstream political agenda. In the UK, apart from the Labour Party's cursory interest in work-life balance in the mid-2010s, the question of working hours has generally disappeared from the agenda, replaced by a focus on employability and the cultivation of a workforce that will ensure the country's competitiveness in a global economy. The stripping back of the welfare state, which in recent times has seen a phased introduction of increasingly stringent penalties for the non-worker, has also significantly reduced the latitude for resistance to work. The ethical superiority of work seems almost untouchable. Paid jobs continue to be promoted as a vital source of good health and character. The media continues obsessively to demonize the non-working scrounger, and an old-fashioned work ethic maintains its anchorage in policies designed to force people off welfare and into employment. Within this political context, my central goal in this book is to argue that the time has come to challenge the work-centered nature of modern society. As it stands, work represents a highly naturalized and taken for granted feature of everyday life. The dogmatic nature of work is revealed when we consider the uncanny resilience of its ethical status, even in the face of some very troubling realities. Consider the woeful failure of today's labor market to keep pace with the desire for jobs that allow for self-expression and creativity. Gratifying work is a fantasy that we have all been trained to invest in, ever since our teachers and parents asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up. Yet most of us are confronted with scant opportunities to consolidate our ambitions in the world of paid employment, a world whose signature features are often drudgery, subordination, and exhaustion. What is also baffling is the fact that the ethical status of work has still not been significantly destabilized by our disintegrating labor market. Mass unemployment, job insecurity, and low-wage work are making employment an increasingly unreliable source of income, rights, and belonging. The orthodox political solution to this situation is job creation, the invention of work by increasing output and expanding the economy into new sectors. However, as a range of concerned scientists and economists are now pointing out, constant growth is not only unlikely to solve the problem, but also brings with it a disturbing set of environmental and social implications. Finally, the dogmatic status of work is also graspable when we consider the extent to which we have unconsciously accommodated work's escalating dominance in our everyday lives. Work has increasingly spilled its demands into our homes, drawing upon our emotions and personalities to an extent never before seen or tolerated. As the ethic of hard work tightens its grip once again, employability becomes the motivating force of our ambitions, interactions, and education system. A side effect of this is that we, as a society, may be losing our grip on the criteria that judge an activity to be worthwhile and meaningful, even if it does not contribute to employability or the needs of the economy. Those activities and relationships that cannot be defended in terms of an economic contribution are being devalued and neglected. It is puzzling that none of these troubling realities has led to a significant public discussion of why we work, and of how work should be socially distributed. What has ultimately prompted me to write this book is a sense of concern that these pressing issues, from dubious job quality to social insecurity, to the escalating dominance of work in our everyday lives, have failed to destabilize the central place of work in mainstream political visions of the future. The storm may be rising, but the work dogma still huddles safely in its bunker. Within this troubling context, there is an urgent need to contemplate some of the taken-for-granted realities of today's work-centered society, to consider alternative ways of meeting the needs conventionally sought in work, and to think about whether there might be more equitable and liberating ways of distributing work and free time. In the first 4 chapters of this book, I undertake this task on a mainly theoretical level. In the later part of the book, however, my focus shifts to investigate the lives of real people who have tried to resist work. Between 2009 and 2014, I spent time with a range of people who were taking significant steps to reduce the presence of work in their lives. While some had reduced their working hours, others had given up work altogether. I wanted to understand what had prompted them to resist work, to find out what they did with their time, and to gain a deeper understanding of the pleasures and difficulties that might be encountered in the process of refusal. Something worth noting from the outset is the relative ordinariness of the people I met. I use the word ordinary with caution here. What I mean to stress is that these people were not ideologically committed activists or members of a coherent social movement. They had no overriding mission or agenda, and whilst a few self-identified as downshifters or idlers, most had not heard of terms like these. Some even found them off-putting. What the people I met shared was simply a common desire to work a little less and live a little more. Overall, were these people successful in their attempts to resist work and live according to their ideals? Here, in the introduction, is not the place for me to say. But over the course of the book we will see that resisting work does carry significant financial and psychological risks. This is definitely not another one of those sugary books that tells its readers they can lead richer and freer lives by doing more of X and less of Y. What I aim to do, rather, is draw upon the views and experiences of the people I met as possible sources of nourishment for a critique and putative refusal of work, a refusal which I ultimately argue must be fought on collective and political terms, and not on an individual basis. I would be pleased if the discussions ahead prompted readers to reflect on their own working arrangements. But there is no implication that the people I met had discovered a key to happiness. More modestly, what the discussions ahead represent are an attempt to remain open to alternatives, and to generate ideas that might contribute positively to a critique of our work-centered society. As to the real-world possibilities for the development of a politics against work, there are reasons to be hopeful and there are reasons to be pessimistic. I take inspiration from Herbert Marcuse, whose provocative works argued that advanced industrial societies are capable of containing all social change, while still maintaining that forces and tendencies exist that can break this containment. Freedom, for Marcuse, is always both impossible and possible. Focusing on both sides, I will highlight the alternative sensibilities and practices from which we might derive inspiration for a politics against work, whilst also acknowledging the extent to which certain cultural and structural features of capitalism militate against the development of social alternatives. Ultimately, the discussions and arguments in this book are best understood as a kind of provocation. The book is intended as an invitation for people to join the critical discussion around work, and I hope that the ideas presented here will be debated, built upon and criticized, and that they will ultimately nourish the desire for change at a time when some critical distance from the existing state of affairs is urgently needed. The structure of this book, setting aside the empirical investigation until a little later in the book, Chapter 1, A Provocation, begins by scrutinizing the concept of work. I clarify what I mean by the term work, explore some of the ways in which society can be thought of as work-centered, and provide a brief introduction to those key critical thinkers who envisaged a less work-centered future. In chapters 2 and 3. I move on to engage with a number of key social issues, with a view to underlining the relevance of a critique of work. Chapter 2, Working Pains, examines the phenomenon of alienation, reflecting on the everyday degradations of working life, be it the repetitive physical tasks of industrial labor, or the more emotionally demanding transactions of modern forms of work. I will consider why the realm of employment might represent an increasingly unsuitable space in which to live out the desire for meaningful and creative activity. Chapter 3, The Colonizing Power of Work, shifts the focus away from work itself to look at the broader impact of work on our everyday lives. It explores how the colonization of our lives by economic demands, to work, to recover from work, to spend income, to cultivate employability, leaves a dwindling segment of life free for activities whose value transcends the economic. I argue that the sheer pace and pragmatism of modern life represent another reason to scrutinize the place of work in society. Chapter 4, The Stronghold of Work, marks the point at which I move on from critical diagnosis to begin considering the scope for resisting this prevailing state of affairs. I begin with the downside, exploring the ways in which the work ethic continues to militate against the possibility of reevaluating work. Both the relentless stigmatization of the non-worker in the media and the conservative attachment to work as an irreplaceable factor of social inclusion and good health represent considerable obstacles to the development of a truly open debate. With regard to the prospects for social change, Chapter 4 is certainly the gloomiest chapter in this book, but it also paves the way for the more forward-looking discussions in Chapters 5, 6, and 7. It is here that I detail my independent inquiry into the lives of real people who have tried to reduce their hours or give up working. Chapter 5, The Breaking Point, looks at some of the values and experiences that might cause a person to break from work, introducing the research participants and their motivations. Chapter 6, Alternative Pleasures, broaches the practical and financial obstacles to resisting work, but also remains open to the idea that there may be new pleasures to be discovered in the shift to a less work-focused, less commodity-intensive lifestyle. Chapter 7, Half a Person, brings the investigation to a close by examining the experiences of shame and isolation that can arise with attempts to resist work. What, if anything, can we hope to learn from the values and experiences of people who are trying to resist work? What are the hidden benefits and follies of their attempts to go against the grain? In the final chapter, From Escapism to Autonomy, I suggest that a transition to a less work-centered existence could represent a more robust and authentic form of freedom than the superficial escapes and liberties granted to us by the present social system. The question that hangs in the balance, however, is whether people's growing disenchantment with work can be harnessed and developed into a genuine political alternative. Chapter 1, A Provocation. Modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all. We have chosen, instead, to have overwork for some and starvation for others. Hitherto we have continued to be as energetic as we were before there were machines. In this we have been foolish. But there is no reason to go on being foolish forever. Bertrand Russell, in praise of idleness in his 1972 book Working, Studs Terkel collected transcripts from over 100 interviews with working Americans, providing an intricate snapshot of American life from an astonishing range of perspectives. In this enormous book, we hear from welders, waiters, cab drivers, housewives, actors, and telephone operators, as each discuss their hopes, fears, and everyday experiences at work. Much of Terkel's book is about the little coping strategies that people use to get through the working day. From pranks and teasing to fantasizing and other strategies of mental detachment. A gas meter reader passes the time by ogling a housewife who sunbathes in her bikini. A waitress makes the day go quicker by gliding between tables, pretending to be a ballerina. A production line worker says fuck it and takes a rest without permission. Standing back to reflect on the interviews in Working, Terkel wrote, "This book, being about work, is, by its very nature, a book about violence, to the spirit as well as the body. It is about ulcers as well as accidents, about shouting matches as well as fistfights, about nervous breakdowns as well as kicking the dog around. It is, above all, about daily humiliations." Many of the accounts featured in Terkel's book give substance to his conclusion that work is violence. Yet some of the book's accounts also offer glimpses of work's pleasures. In one memorable case, a piano tuner portrayed his work as an artistic exercise, describing how he would enter an almost hypnotic state of concentration and aesthetic delight as he brought harmony to the pianos. His account brings to mind the notion of the flow state, a psychological condition of complete and blissful absorption in the task at hand, entered when a work task synchronizes with a person's skill level and interests. In the flow, one loses track of time and space, focusing only on the craft. It is the opposite experience to that of the bored worker who watches the ticking clock, unable to shake his physical surroundings from his mind. The delight of Terkel's piano tuner is a form of pleasure unfamiliar to many people. In modern capitalist societies, access to satisfying and engaging work is profoundly unequal. For those who work in jobs with dubious social utility, subjected to the latest innovations in workplace organization and control, work often represents a struggle against boredom, meaninglessness, and exhaustion. A range of personal tactics help us to survive the working day. We remind ourselves that we are more interesting than the jobs we do. We stage imaginary rebellions against bosses and clients, or we hide away in shells of cynicism. Sometimes we construct elaborate escapes and compensations out of hours in an effort to forget. In later chapters I will introduce people who describe work as an external, coercive pressure in their lives. They talk about how they felt compressed, controlled, and forced in their work. They said that work made them feel watched from behind, penned in like battery hens, or dominated by a big beast. The perceived meaninglessness of the work they performed represented a significant source of distress. Matthew, only in his mid-20s, said that the thought of working in retail or an office job made him panic about death. His anxieties reminded me of something Terkel once said in a television interview. "The jobs are not big enough for people's spirits." Work is not without resistance, of course. Activists and labor scholars continue to address the pressing need for fairer pay, better quality jobs, and more democratic relationships in the workplace. These important issues delineate the traditional terrain of trade unions and the politics of the left. They are all extremely pressing issues and the fight is far from won, but it is crucial that we also think beyond workers' rights to confront a broader and more fundamental set of questions. What is so great about work that sees society constantly trying to create more of it? Why, at the pinnacle of society's productive development, is there still thought to be a need for everybody to work for most of the time? What is work for, and what else could we be doing in the future? Were we no longer cornered into spending most of our time working? As we will see, such questions are part of a well-established history of critical thinking on the meaning, purpose, and future of work. If such questions are rarely posed outside of this academic clique, however, it is perhaps because they ask us to scrutinize realities that are usually accepted as natural and inevitable. It may feel like there is little incentive to reflect critically on work from a position where most of us, irrespective of our attitudes towards work, are pretty much obliged to perform it anyway. To take a critical stance on work may even seem distasteful or elitist in the context of a society where jobs are so highly sought after. In regions racked by poverty and high rates of unemployment, what people are feeling is a need for more work, not less. But it should be noted that the thinkers introduced here are in no way ignorant or in denial of this fact. It would be senseless to dispute the fact that most of us experience a powerful need to work. What we can dispute, however, is the celebrated prominence of work in the cultural, ethical, and political life of advanced industrial societies. What is baffling, from the perspective of work's critics, is the notion that the activity of work should continue to be valued more than other pastimes, practices, and forms of social contribution. The work-centered society we live in a work-centered society, and this is true in a number of senses. First of all, work represents society's main mechanism for the distribution of income. Work is therefore the central avenue through which people access material necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter, as well as the commercial entertainments and escapes offered by modern consumerism. The centrality of work is also grasped when we consider the sheer amount of time spent working, in which I also include the time spent preparing for, training for, searching for, worrying about, and traveling to and from work, as well as the fact that for most people, work represents the main center of social life outside the family. In affluent societies, work is one of the most conventional and readily available means through which we become part of the pattern of other people's lives. Engagement in paid work also marks the passage to adulthood, showing that the child has matured, gained independence, and accepted what it means to live in the real world. The connection between identity and occupation is forged from a young age, with children being prompted by parents and educators to refine their career aspiration and begin cultivating their employability. In the work-centered society, the most readily accepted purpose of education is the socialization of young people for the successful adoption of a predefined work role. If every society has its own way of measuring achievement, in affluent societies this is usually through work. Conversations with strangers often start with the question, "What do you do?" And it is common knowledge that this question represents an abbreviation for "What job do you perform?" The tendency to treat occupations as the yardsticks of social status is revealed in the prevalence of clumsy modern euphemisms, often designed to puff up society's less auspicious forms of work. The bin man works in waste and sanitation management, the fry cook is part of the culinary team, and the unemployed person is between jobs. Reflecting on these quirks of modern usage, Turkle suggested that the people who embrace such terms are not necessarily ashamed of the work they do. Instead, they are justifiably defending themselves from a society which is obsessed with measuring status through work, and therefore looks upon them as a lesser species. It is clear that work represents much more than an economic necessity and a social duty. In affluent societies, work is powerfully promoted as the pivot around which identities are properly formed. It is valorized as a medium of personal growth and fulfillment, and constructed as a means of acquiring social recognition and respect. All of this we recognize, even if work's ultimate function is in most cases to generate private profit. If work can be described as central on a cultural level, then it is certainly also central at the level of politics. In the UK, apart from New Labour's cursory interest in work-life balance in the mid-2010s, the question of working hours and the entitlement of people to lead active and varied lives outside work has long been absent from the mainstream political agenda. Mainstream politics focuses its efforts on job creation and employability, with political rhetoric continuing to promote traditional beliefs about the sanctity and dignity of work. This is particularly evident in the moral tones of discussions about unemployment. In 1985, Klausoff wrote that the persistence of mass unemployment, particularly if it were concentrated in particular regions, might put an end to the stigmatization of unemployed people, since the rate of joblessness could no longer be accounted for plausibly in terms of individual failure or guilt. Yet we can now see that Off's confidence was misplaced, failing to anticipate the moral fortification of work in neoliberalism, which has seen a revamped ideological focus on the virtues of hardworking people versus society's so-called scroungers and skivers. The ethical lines have been drawn. Are you a worker or a shirker? This moralization of work has been enshrined in the latest social policies as enforcing work, no matter how dubious its social utility, is adopted as a key function of the state. In recent times, the stripping back of the welfare system has seen a phased introduction of increasingly stringent audits and penalties for the non-worker. Even groups that have been traditionally exempted from the duty to work, such as single parents and people with disabilities, have found themselves under scrutiny in the drive to move people off welfare and into employment. All of this has significantly reduced the latitude for developing lifestyles based around activities other than paid work. The sociologist Catherine Casey justifiably summarizes: whether one is in or out of employment, preparing for it, or seeking it, and certainly whether or not one likes one's job, work as it is conventionally organized significantly shapes everyday life experience for most people in industrial societies. In this chapter, I begin formulating a response to this situation by taking on the task of denaturalizing work, this most central and taken for granted feature of our lives, and opening it up as an object for critical discussion. If work is indeed a central source of sociality, rights, status, and belonging, then it is important to recognize that this situation is a social and historical construction, and not a fixed feature of some natural order. First, I need to clarify what I mean by the term work and, in the process, make some preliminary remarks about what it might mean to engage in a critique of work. Following this, I briefly touch upon a number of studies that chart the historical emergence of work, with a view to developing some critical distance from its central role in modern capitalist societies. In the final part of the chapter, I provide an introduction to those critical authors who have challenged the centrality of work by promoting a radical reduction of working time. In the compelling and unorthodox visions of these authors, work, instead of being central, would be subordinated to the need for human autonomy and the leading of richer, more varied lives. What work as the concept of work invokes an extremely varied set of ideas and images, and any attempt to define it quickly leads us into a web of caveats, contradictions, and gray areas. For some people, the word work may call to mind the joys of craft and creativity. Marx suggested that, in its ideal form, work is the defining activity of humanity. In this view, humans are distinguished from other animals by their ability to conceive of and subsequently craft a world of artificial objects, opening up possibilities for new trajectories of development. In artistic circles, the term work has a similarly auspicious ring to it, and is often used in its noun form, my work, meaning the material embodiment of my talents and sensibilities, my intangible inner world made tangible. Work, in the sense of aesthetic creation, might even be seen as a quest for immortality, expressing the producer's desire to create durable evidence of his or her finite existence in the world. From great structures like churches and bridges to cultural artifacts like novels and video games, all of these things are the product of work. The trouble with defining work in these terms, however, as a form of creative activity, is that it becomes difficult to know what we should call work that is not creative but menial and routine. Workers who complain about their jobs in call centers, on supermarket checkouts, or at computers, inputting data day after day, are more likely to view their work as a means of self-preservation rather than self-expression. For all of us whose survival depends on submission to the daily grind, work conjures a less romantic set of images. It calls to mind the sense of dread associated with words like chore, travail, or burden. In these cases, work does not represent a source of joy or a form of self-expression, but that blank part of the day which must be endured until 5 p.m., the coveted hour when work releases its grip and we can finally be ourselves again. Adding to the complications surrounding work's definition, we can also observe the morally loaded nature of the term work, which is often used to smuggle in ethical views about the respectability of certain activities over others. In a social context where engagement in work is tied with what it means to be respectable, socially included, and worthy of recognition, the question of which activities society chooses to allow into the category of proper work becomes an important one. Domestic work, along with certain forms of artistic, intellectual, or care work, continues to sit uncomfortably on the fringes of what society is prepared to categorize as actual work, especially in cases where the value of these activities cannot be explained in terms of any measurable social or economic contribution. If the meaning of work in everyday usage remains ambiguous and contested, this is certainly also the case in the academic realm, where we find a disconcertingly complex history of attempts to define work. In this book I will follow André Gorz's observation that the prevailing cultural understanding of work in modern capitalist societies is that it is an activity carried out for a wage. Colloquially, it seems that the label work is most often used to distinguish paid from unpaid activities, and refers to the operations performed in jobs, things that we go to and come home from. Illustrating this definition, Gorz suggested that a market gardener can be said to work, whilst a miner growing leeks in his back garden is carrying out a freely chosen activity. Elsewhere, Gores has referred to this predominant understanding of work as work in the economic sense. It represents the contractual exchange of a certain amount of productive time for a wage, and is distinguished from the separate category of work for ourselves. If one of the key characteristics of a paid job is that it serves society in a general sense, work for ourselves is distinctive because the worker performs it for the direct benefit of either himself or others with whom he shares a relationship outside the commercial sphere. Work for ourselves is conducted according to principles of reciprocity and mutuality rather than commercial exchange. It has the quality of a gift, performed out of respect for, or a sense of obligation to, others. In today's employment-centered society, work for ourselves tends to be limited to domestic chores such as grocery shopping, cooking and cleaning, squeezed unhappily into evenings and weekends. However, in a society with more free time, Gores believed that this category could in theory encompass a whole host of activities. Anything from repairs to community gardening, healthcare, and informal education. Both work in the economic sense and work for ourselves are contrasted with a third category, which Gores called autonomous activities. Autonomous activities encompass those actions which are performed as ends in themselves. They are self-initiated and stem from a conscious choice which nothing forces the person to make. From an individual's perspective, the primary goal of autonomous activities is not to earn money, nor is it necessarily to meet any purpose that can be easily put into words. Instead, autonomous activities pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful, as defined by the subject performing them. The value of such activities cannot be measured in terms of economic worth or social utility. Autonomous activities are undertaken for their own sake, out of pleasure or interest. One Gores suggested that a telltale sign of autonomous activities is that the actions which achieve the goal may confer as much personal satisfaction as actually scoring it. I have no wish to belabor the differences between work's various guises any further, so it can be summarized that both the theorists and interviewees introduced in this book are turning a critical eye on the first of the categories described above, i.e., work in the economic sense. It is important to make these distinctions here, in order to recognize from the outset that the critique of work does not amount to a refusal of productive activity in any general sense, at least not for the critique's more respectable proponents. In 1883, from his cell in Saint-Pélagie prison, the French author Paul Lafargue famously wrote a pamphlet entitled The Right to be Lazy. In the pamphlet, Lafargue attacked the widespread belief in the duty and sanctity of work. He wrote, "A strange delusion possesses the working classes of the nations where capitalist civilization holds its sway. This delusion drags in its train the individual and social woes which for 2 centuries have tortured sad humanity. This delusion is the love of work, the furious passion for work, pushed even to the exhaustion of the vital force of the individual and his progeny." It should perhaps be noted that Lafargue was writing satirically, as a provocateur more than a scholar. Yet his contribution is worth dwelling on because it contains a number of elements that are unrepresentative of the critique of work presented in this book. The first point of contention is Lafargue's reference to the delusions of workers and their apparently crazy desire for work. I would suggest that to work diligently is not necessarily to labor under a delusion. As workers, our choices and behaviors are shaped and limited by a specific set of moral, material, and political pressures, which is to say that the social system of advanced industrial societies is constructed so that working is often the only way that most people can meet their needs. This includes material needs, for food, clothing, shelter, and also more complex psychological needs, such as the need for social recognition and esteem. As we will see later in the book, attempts to live without work, however enlightened their rationale may be, often carry significant financial and psychological risks. Let us not also forget that work is experienced by many people as a tremendous source of enjoyment and achievement. There is a great deal of satisfaction to be found in clubbing together to get something done, breaking a sweat, using the hands and mind in unison, and so on. The ethical discourse around the pleasure and dignity of productive work is not entirely an accessory of exploitation. Even in cases where the content of a job is relatively meaningless, the job in question might still be enjoyed, or at least valued as an opportunity to break away from the constriction of life in the private domain. It is partly on this basis that feminism has fought for the right of women to work, provides an escape from the narrowness and stifling conformity of the domestic unit or village community, a way of meeting people from other places with whom relationships can be freer, less familiar, than with those who first and foremost see you as daughter or daughter-in-law, sister or cousin, and tie you to a carefully regulated world where everyone must keep to their allotted place. To speak of the delusions of workers, as Lafargue did, is to pull the critique in the wrong direction. What is put forward in this book is a critique of work, and specifically not a critique of workers, i.e., what is offered is a critique of the moral, material, and political pressures that bear down on the worker. and not a set of judgments about the attitudes of workers themselves. The second contentious element of Lafargue's contribution is his title's reference to a right to be lazy. Once again, we must acknowledge Lafargue's playfulness here, but it is also important to recognize from the outset that the critique of work is not a defense of laziness. It instead expresses a desire to widen the space for autonomous activities and to reclaim the time to work for ourselves, even if a palatable chunk of time to be lazy has a rightful place in the vision to liberate workers. What is ultimately demanded is less a right to laziness than a right to realize human capacities more fully. Cathy Weeks puts it well when she writes that to critique work is not necessarily to deny that work has any value. It is, rather, to insist that there are other ways to organize and distribute that activity and to remind us that it is also possible to be creative outside the boundaries of work. It is to suggest that there might be a variety of ways to experience the pleasure that we may now find in work, as well as other pleasures that we may wish to discover, cultivate, and enjoy. The critique of work also reminds us that the willingness to live for and through work renders subjects supremely fit for capitalist purposes. If the authors and research participants introduced in this book are critical of work, it is not because they defend the right to be lazy, but because the obligation to paid employment so often precludes the possibility of engaging in activities that are genuinely creative, collaborative, and useful. The beginning of work. We can begin opening up work as an object of critical inquiry by briefly considering its historical contingency. The scholars who have undertaken this task have found that work, even in the broader sense of productive activity, has not always been valued as a personal boon. In the book of Genesis, a life of work was administered by God as a punishment to Adam and Eve. Work was also regarded as a curse in ancient Greece, where it represented a base and menial form of activity. Work was disdained because it symbolized necessity, the enslavement of humans by their bodily need for survival, and it was not something that free people should be forced to perform. It was instead designated to slaves, persons who were cut off from society because their labors excluded them from those pursuits considered to be more worthy of a citizen, such as politics, art, and quiet contemplation. The freedom of Greek citizens to participate in intellectual and political life was to be earned by subjecting others to necessity by force. Hannah Arendt wrote that, condemned to a life of toil, the slave's degradation was a blow of fate, and a fate worse than death, because it carried with it the metamorphosis of man into something akin to a tame animal. One of the most prominent studies on the history of attitudes towards work is Max Weber's classic The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Originally published in 1904, Weber's analysis focused on the cultural forces that helped to shape capitalism, highlighting the historically emergent nature of the modern attachment to work. Weber compared modernity with what he termed the traditional society, in which people moderated the amount of work they performed in accordance with a well-defined set of needs. In the traditional or pre-capitalist society, work was only tolerated insofar as it was necessary. A man does not by nature wish to earn more and more money, but simply to live as he is accustomed to live and earn as much as necessary for that purpose. The harvester, when offered a higher rate of pay, did not therefore dream of the extra money he could earn, but calculated how much less work he could perform in order to earn the same comfortable amount as before. His main priority was to preserve his free time, rather than to increase his financial reward. We might say that the harvester worked to live, rather than living to work. Weber argued that this traditional orientation to work was transformed by the rise of a Puritan morality or a Protestant ethic, which began to endorse work as a virtuous end in itself. He traced this ethical commitment to work back to the Reformation, which saw Puritan values spilling out of the monasteries and into wider society, teaching people to seek salvation through a dedication to work. According to this religious morality, work should be undertaken zealously, as a vocation or spiritual calling, but its financial rewards were not to be enjoyed or used to finance periods of idleness. Weber also discussed the influential teachings of the pastor John Calvin, who famously preached the notion of predestination, the religious belief that only a limited, predetermined elect were destined for salvation in the kingdom of heaven. Calvin taught that success in work was a sign of God's grace, and he prescribed commitment to work as a method of calming personal fears about the threat of eternal damnation. Through this convergence of moral ideals and religious teachings, work had been elevated to the status of an ethical imperative. Whilst there is undoubtedly still a puritanical streak to the modern commitment to work, this is not to suggest that puritanical values remain a conscious source of motivation for today's workers. Presenting a story familiar to students of social theory, Weber argued that the ascetic compulsion to work kick-started a legacy of rational organization. In their dedication to work, business owners became more efficient and productive in their labors. installing bureaucracies and standardizing working procedures. As capitalism developed, entrepreneurs who failed to run an effective and competitive business went bust. And the idyllic state, where work was performed as a spiritual vocation, eventually gave way to a bitter, competitive struggle. This process of rationalization produced what Weber, in the title of his essay, called the spirit of capitalism. Having established itself as a universe in which people felt destined to participate, capitalism no longer required the Puritans' values to support it. Capitalism at the time of its development needed laborers who were available for economic exploitation for conscience sake. Today it is in the saddle, and hence able to force people to labor without transcendental sanctions. Weber's key point was that the morality of work had become embedded in the fabric of capitalist societies. The work ethic prowls about our lives like the ghost of dead religious beliefs. Marx made a similar point in his famous reference to the dull compulsion of economic relations, which also draws attention to the ritualistic quality of work. We work partly because it feels like the natural thing to do. In more recent times, there has also been some debate over whether workers in affluent societies continue to be motivated by a moral attachment to work, or whether the work ethic has been eroded by a more hedonistic desire to work for material rewards. Analyzing the rise of American consumer culture, Daniel Bell suggested that, throughout the 20th century, the bourgeois values of hard work, frugality, and self-control were becoming increasingly irrelevant, and that by the 1950s people were concerned no longer about how to work and achieve, but how to spend and enjoy. We can note, however, that regardless of the extent to which the traditional work ethic has been surpassed by consumer hedonism, the outcome in terms of people's behavior remains largely the same. What is retained in either case is a disciplined attachment to working for a wage. Herbert Marcuse recognized this in his book One-Dimensional Man, where he argued that the development of capitalism had seen a mounting harmonization between the desire for sensual gratification and the production of cultural conformity. Modern consumer culture is perfectly consistent with work discipline, partly because the need to pay for commercial pleasures compels people to commit more of their time and effort to earning money. Indulgence and escapism, far from being cultural taboos, are relentlessly encouraged in modern capitalist societies, but always with the drawback that their enjoyment requires us to heighten our commitment to work. In this account, mass consumption has not killed the work ethic but simply augmented it, taking the place of religion as society's chief distraction from work's more troubling realities. The value of historical perspectives is that they allow us to achieve some critical distance from the current work-centered state of affairs. Weeks suggests that Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is particularly valuable in this regard, with its references to periods before and after the heyday of the Protestant work ethic inviting readers to grasp the peculiarity of modern society's attachment to work. Readers are invited to reflect forwards and consider the lofty status of work from the standpoint of the values inherent in the old, traditional society. What seems startling from this perspective is the limitlessness of the modern desire for material wealth, as well as the fact that work would one day operate as a main axis of identity. Weber also invites readers to look backwards and consider the emergence of the work ethic from the perspective of the modern, secularized society. What startles in this case is the fact that the most rational and instrumental of all modern activities, the performance of disciplined, productive work, is the product of a religious ethic which is wildly irrational in its origins. From the point of view of modern workers and their more secular or self-interested system of values, the Puritan's willingness to sacrifice himself to work, irrespective of its content or material rewards, seems completely bizarre. Weber's main focus was on the moral fortification of work, but we can note that workers in the 1900 seconds were also bound to labor via new and aggressive techniques of work discipline, developed during the rise of the factory system. Workers' inclinations to self-limit the duration and intensity of their labor were attacked not only by the work ethic, but also by more tangible transformations in the working day itself. The payment of workers became tied to working hours, and labor was regimented and synchronized via the adoption of clock time. By the 20th century, industrialization had provided unparalleled opportunities for managers to coordinate the pace and procedures of the labor process. Work was divided down into predictable, routine tasks, and the pace of work was dictated by the moving assembly line. Alertness and punctuality were policed via penalties and surveillance technologies, and workers were reminded, as per Benjamin Franklin's well-known dictum, that time is money. Through these combined processes, punctuality, efficiency, and productivity became the mottos of the working day. The British economist William Beveridge also played a significant role in the struggle to integrate workers. His system of labor exchanges represented a deliberate attempt to exclude workers who wanted to self-limit their labor. In Beveridge's own words, "For the man who wants to get a casual job now and again, The exchange will make that wish impossible. If a worker refused to work full-time, then the exchanges were instructed to deny him work. Beveridge's attack on casual labor was also implemented via his changes to the 1911 National Insurance Act, which was modified to extract higher tax contributions from employers who used casual laborers. These techniques represented a more blatant, coercive kind of discipline than the moral education of the worker described by Weber. Other authors have dealt with the historical development of attitudes towards work in much greater detail than I have space for here. But what emerges in all of their analyses is the fact that people's subjective reconciliation with work lagged far behind the objective, quantitative expansion of work witnessed in the industrializing society. It appears that early capitalism faced considerable difficulty in persuading people to adopt regular, disciplined employment, and that resistance to full-time work persisted well into the 20th century, particularly in industrial sectors that had traditionally relied on casual laborers. The history of capitalism is a history involving the gradual reconciliation of individuals with the sacrifices of the working day. This was not a smooth process, but a struggle requiring a severe restructuring of workers' habits. In all these ways, by the division of labor, the supervision of labor, fines, bells and clocks, money incentives, preachings and schoolings, the suppression of fairs and sports, new labor habits were formed. If the work-centered nature of society has become so naturalized as to seem inevitable, an appreciation of the historical and contingent nature of attitudes to work helps us to achieve a degree of critical distance from this highly normalized state of affairs. Work has not always been at the center of society's moral, cultural and political life. And I now turn to a range of social critics who have questioned whether it both can and should hold on to this position in the future. The End of Work. This book is ultimately concerned with one question: might it be possible, in the future, for everybody to work less and have more time for their own autonomous self-development? This is not a novel question, but a question that is woven into an intellectual tradition spanning centuries. The thinkers in this tradition hail from a range of different backgrounds, but what unites them all is a broad concern with the emancipatory transformation of society. Regardless of their angle of approach, their ultimate focus has been on the agonizing rift between present realities and future possibilities. As Eric Olin Wright writes, let us begin with a simple, indisputable observation. The world in which we live involves a juxtaposition of extraordinary productivity, affluence, and enhanced opportunities for human creativity and fulfillment, along with continuing human misery and thwarted human potential. The commentaries introduced here, which have all questioned work's future, are components of the broader project of critical social theory, which has always begun with Wright's indisputable observation. The overall goal of critical social theory has been to submit processes of social development to scrutiny, reflecting upon the obstacles they might pose for the flourishing of human capacities. Whether these capacities are physical, artistic, intellectual, social, moral, or spiritual. The critique of work is usually thought of as a Marxist tradition, but in truth a number of its key themes emerged before Marx in the work of early utopian writers such as Charles Fourier, William Morris, and Thomas More. Fourier, for example, believed that work had the potential to become a main source of gratification and the fullest expression of human powers, but was troubled by the rift between his ideal and experiences of the real work provided by industrial capitalism. He referred to the mills and factories of the early 19th century as veritable graveyards, where the workers were motivated by nothing more than a joyless concern for their own survival. Work was performed with a sense of dreary necessity, producing a weariness in the workers that would also poison their leisure time. Fourier contrasted this miserable reality with his theory of attractive labor, developed in his detailed blueprints for harmony, a utopian society beyond the historical phase he called civilization. In harmony, work would be organized in such a way as to fill the worker with passion and eagerness, rather than dread. Workers would be able to choose their work freely, carrying out a broad variety of productive activities in pleasant surroundings. With both a spirit of cooperation and a healthy sense of competition, pleasurable work would be the centerpiece of Fourier's utopia, becoming an almost play-like activity, and virtually eliminating the worker's need for rest and escape. Fourier's desire to dissolve the boundary between work and play was later echoed by William Morris, who also blamed the joyless realities of labor on its imposed nature, as an activity forced upon us by the present system of producing for the profit of privileged classes. Like Fourier, Morris was interested in the prospect of transforming work into a source of pleasure and aesthetic delight. It should become a feature of what he called the ornamental part of life. He was more tentative than Fourier on the matter of how this might be achieved, though Morris did deviate from Fourier in one important way. What is significant for the purposes of our discussion is that Morris was one of the earlier commentators to seriously propose the idea of working less, whereas Fourier believed that even the most menial work could be made pleasurable in a manner that would allow a welcome extension of the working day. Morris argued for the elimination of unpleasant toil through a wholesale reduction of work. This particular theme can actually be traced as far back as St. Thomas More's Utopia, initially published in 1516. Well before the advent of industrial society, in More's utopian vision, the need for toil would be reduced by producing sturdier goods, by limiting the production of goods judged to be superfluous, and by sharing the necessary work more equally among the population. It is in relation to the prospects for reducing toil that writers like Morris, witnessing the rapid growth of industry, also began to debate the possible applications of technology. Would the increasing efficiency of production technologies eventually allow citizens a greater degree of freedom from unpleasant toil? Morris thought that it would, such that unattractive labor would be but a very light burden on each individual. Whilst we can find older examples in the work of these early utopian writers, the critique of work is usually discussed in connection with Marx. It is Marx's ideas that inspired the rich vein of theories and research around the spiritual and psychological tolls of working, although there has also been some debate over Marx's exact relationship with the argument for a reduction and decentralization of work too. In one of the more well-known passages from Volume 3 of Capital, Marx does indeed appear to foreshadow the argument for shorter working hours. In this passage, Marx relegates work to the mundane realm of necessity. He sees it as the obligatory toil that must be surmounted before humans can really begin living in the realm of freedom, where they become available for the world and its culture. Marx was explicit in his suggestion that the realm of freedom can be expanded by shortening the working day. We also find a similar argument in relation to Marx's mixed views on technology. For Marx, although machine technologies represented an instrument for controlling and degrading work, their tremendous productive capacities could also theoretically be directed towards the reduction of necessary labor. Leaving a greater space for freedom outside work is instrumental in creating the means of social disposable time, and so in reducing working time for the whole society to a minimum, and thus making everyone's time free for their own development. Marx's mixed views on technology foreshadowed a central premise in what some writers would later call the end-of-work argument, which is based on the assumption that advances in production technologies are gradually eliminating the need for human labor. Within the existing structures of capitalist society, the displacement of workers by mechanization and productivity growth is obviously a grave cause for concern. It leads to forced unemployment, spelling poverty and social exclusion for thousands of people. However, the elimination of human labor by developments in production technology has also been celebrated by the end-of-work authors, because it opens up the theoretical possibility of a huge expansion of free time. There have been many versions of this core idea. We find one such version in a famous essay by John Maynard Keynes, for whom the promise of greater freedom from work seemed like a realistic and relatively imminent possibility. In his essay on the economic possibilities for our grandchildren, first published in the 1930s, Keynes predicted that advances in production technology might reduce work time and allow the population as a whole to work less, as little as 15 hours per week by the year 2030. Keynes discussed this in terms of the economic problem having finally been solved by society. It would be at this juncture that man would have the privilege of confronting a deeper problem: how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. Whether the possibility of orienting production towards the end of greater human autonomy can ever be realized, of course, depends not only on the ability of technologies to alleviate the need for toil, but also on society's moral and political commitments. To what and whose ends will new technologies be applied? How will savings in work time be socially distributed? To what extent should society tolerate the unchecked growth of the economy? To what extent does it remain rational to uphold the work ethic as a cultural ideal? If society is ever going to realize the true benefits of technological development, we need to engage in a political discussion. In Marcuse's words, we need to talk about how society's technological and intellectual resources can best be used for the optimal development and satisfaction of individual needs and faculties with a minimum of toil and misery.